Jane was the picture of contentment, a loving wife, a dedicated partner, and a woman whose life seemed to be a flawless tapestry of family, love, and trust. She had always believed in the beauty of her marriage to Tom. He was everything she ever wanted: kind, responsible, and affectionate. They shared a deep bond, built over years of shared memories, quiet evenings, and mutual respect. Jane never once doubted Tom's devotion. In her eyes, their life together was the epitome of happiness. Their home, though modest, was filled with warmth, laughter, and the comfort of familiarity. Jane never questioned his loyalty, as he had always been there for her, both in good times and in bad. Then there was Evelyn, Jane's mother, a woman who had been there since the beginning. Evelyn was more than just a mother. She was Jane's confidant, her best friend, and her guiding light. Their bond was unbreakable. Evelyn had been a constant presence in Jane's life, offering wisdom, love, and support, whether it was weekend shopping trips or quiet afternoons spent sipping tea. The two of them shared a relationship grounded in trust and mutual respect. Jane never imagined that her relationship with Evelyn, the woman who had taught her what love and loyalty truly meant, could ever be anything less than perfect. Tom and Evelyn had been there for every milestone in Jane's life: weddings, anniversaries, family celebrations, never once hinting that something darker lurked beneath the surface. But what Jane didn't know, what no one suspected, was that everything she trusted was about to be shattered. At first, the changes were so subtle that Jane barely noticed them. The first sign came on an ordinary evening, just another night spent at home with Tom after a long day. They sat down to dinner, but something was different. Tom was quieter than usual, his usual charm replaced by a distracted air. His eyes kept flickering to his phone, a habit he didn't have before. Jane, always so in tune with him, couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease, but she quickly dismissed it. He's probably just tired, she thought. He had been working late lately, after all. But the strange behavior continued. Over the next few weeks, Tom became more distant, his conversations with Jane growing more superficial. When they spoke, his replies seemed half-hearted, as if his mind was somewhere else. Jane couldn't pinpoint it, but there was a shift, a distance she couldn't close. He'd disappear into his office, sometimes for hours, only emerging when dinner was ready, and even then his mind seemed preoccupied. He no longer took the time to talk about their day or share the little things that once brought them closer. At first, Jane brushed it off. Maybe it was work. Maybe it was stress, she reasoned. Tom had always been a hard worker, dedicated to providing for them. Yet, as the days went by, a growing discomfort gnawed at her. She caught him on the phone more often than usual, his conversations soft and guarded, his tone sharper. When Jane walked into the room, his voice would falter, and he would quickly end the call. It was a small thing, but it made her stomach twist with an odd feeling she couldn't ignore. Then there was Evelyn, Jane's mother, who had always been so open and warm, seemed to behave strangely when Tom was around. At first, Jane couldn't put her finger on it, but there was something off, something distant in Evelyn's demeanor. She would smile less when Tom was present, her eyes avoiding direct contact with him. Jane noticed her mother growing unusually quiet during family meals, offering only short replies to Tom's questions, as if lost in thought. It was small things at first. Evelyn's forced laughter, her avoidance of Tom's gaze, the way she seemed to freeze whenever Jane mentioned his name. Jane didn't want to confront her mother about it, not without any solid reason. After all, it was still early, but something about the way Evelyn acted around Tom felt wrong, like a secret was hanging in the air, unspoken yet palpable. One afternoon, Jane decided to pay her mother a visit without Tom, thinking a quiet moment between the two of them might help clear the tension she'd been sensing. They sat in Evelyn's kitchen, sipping tea, when Jane asked her about Tom. The moment the question left her lips, Evelyn stiffened. It wasn't obvious, but Jane saw the flicker of panic in her mother's eyes, a fleeting moment of unease. It was the same look that Jane had seen in Tom's eyes when he'd been caught off guard by a question. "Is everything all right with Tom?" Jane asked casually, trying to sound nonchalant. "Oh, yes, dear. Everything's fine," Evelyn replied quickly, her voice too high, almost forced. But Jane could tell something was off. Evelyn's words were hollow, her smile too tight. There was something more she wasn't saying. The unease began to settle in Jane's chest, heavy and uncomfortable. She tried to push the thoughts away, to ignore the whispering doubts in her mind, but they refused to go unnoticed. Late one night, after Tom had gone to bed, Jane found herself alone in their living room, mind racing with questions. She'd always prided herself on her intuition, her ability to trust those she loved, but now she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. There was a shift in the atmosphere of their home, a shift she couldn't explain, but she knew it was there. Still, Jane couldn't bring herself to believe the worst. She didn't want to. Tom was her husband, her partner in everything. Her mother, too, was someone she trusted completely. But the evidence was mounting, and deep down, Jane knew she couldn't ignore it much longer. The suspicion, once a whisper, was now a scream inside her mind. Something was happening, and it was about to change everything. But Jane, ever the optimist, chose to believe it was just her mind playing tricks on her. After all, she told herself, these are just small things. They can't mean anything. But the truth was, she was already seeing the first cracks in her once perfect world. One evening, Jane was cleaning the guest room when she made a discovery that would shatter everything she believed about her life, her marriage, and the people she loved. As she moved a stack of books off the desk, a small envelope slipped from beneath them, its corner peeking out from under a pile of papers. Jane wasn't the type to snoop. She had always trusted Tom completely, but something about the way the envelope was tucked away seemed wrong. Her heart raced as she reached for it, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. The envelope was plain, with no return address or markings. It wasn't unusual for Tom to get private correspondence, especially regarding work or personal matters. But this felt different. Something about it caught her attention, something that whispered for her to open it. She hesitated for a moment, then carefully slid her finger under the flap, revealing the contents inside. At first, the letter seemed like a typical note, written in a familiar hand, elegant and neat. But as Jane read, her hands began to tremble. The words leapt off the page, each sentence cutting deeper than the last. My love, you are everything to me. I know it's wrong, but every moment without you feels unbearable. I'm willing to sacrifice anything for us to be together. Just say the word, and we'll leave it all behind. You and me, together forever. The ink seemed to blur as Jane's eyes filled with tears. She read the letter over and over, her brain desperately trying to make sense of the words. The letter was addressed to Tom, but it was the signature that caught her off guard. Evelyn, her mother, the woman who had always been by her side, the one who had held her during her darkest moments. Shock hit her like a physical blow. Jane stood frozen, her body shaking, her mind racing. She dropped the letter to the floor, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. It was as if the ground had been pulled out from under her, leaving her in a free fall of disbelief. Evelyn, the woman who had helped raise her, the woman she trusted more than anyone, had been having an affair with her husband. She staggered backward, her eyes wide with horror as the full weight of the situation began to settle in. The image of her mother's face flashed before her eyes, the warm, loving expressions she had seen all her life, now tainted by the cruel reality she had just uncovered. The thought of Tom's cold, secretive behavior suddenly made sense. His late nights, the guarded phone calls, the forced smiles, they had all been lies, a part of the web of betrayal that had ensnared them both. Her mind raced with questions. How long had it been going on? Why hadn't she seen it? Had she been so blind, so desperate to maintain the peace, that she had ignored every sign? Then, like a wave crashing against her chest, a surge of anger and betrayal rushed through her veins. It wasn't just Tom she was angry at. It was Evelyn, too. The person who should have been there to protect her had broken her trust in the most devastating way possible. It felt like a raw, jagged wound deep inside her, one that would never heal. Jane's thoughts blurred into a chaotic spiral as she grabbed her phone and dialed Tom's number. Her fingers shook and her heart pounded in her chest. He picked up on the second ring, his voice casual, as if nothing was wrong. "Hey, babe, everything okay?" "Don't babe me," Jane snapped, her voice cracking with emotion. "How long, Tom? How long have you been sleeping with my mother?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Jane could hear the shift in his voice as the realization of what she had found set in. "Jane, I didn't want you to find out like this. It wasn't meant to—" "Save it," she interrupted, her fury bubbling over. "I want you to tell me everything. Now." Her hands clenched into fists as she held the phone to her ear, the words she had just read echoing in her mind. There would be no more hiding, no more pretending. She wasn't sure if she could ever forgive him or her mother, but one thing was certain. She needed answers. Now the room felt smaller, suffocating. The truth she had uncovered crushed her, leaving her with nothing but a hollow ache in her chest. But in the midst of the heartbreak, there was something else, something darker: rage. It surged through her like a fire, burning away the last remnants of her trust in the people she loved most. As she stood there, staring at the crumpled letter on the floor, Jane knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. The betrayal was complete, and with it, so too was the fragile facade of the life she had built with Tom and Evelyn. The air was thick with tension when Jane called her mother and husband into the living room. Her heart pounded as she prepared for the confrontation that would change everything. She had been pacing the room for what felt like hours, every moment feeling like a countdown to an inevitable explosion. The letter still sat on the coffee table, a constant reminder of the devastating truth she had uncovered. Tom walked in first, his casual demeanor seemingly at odds with the storm brewing inside Jane. He smiled, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, his eyes betraying none of the guilt he must have been carrying. Jane didn't return the smile. Instead, she stared at him, her eyes narrowed, her expression cold. "Evelyn's on her way," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. Tom furrowed his brow. What's going on, Jane? You're acting strange. I know about the affair, she said, her voice steady, though it quivered with a mixture of anger and betrayal. I know everything. The words hit Tom like a slap in the face. For a brief moment, he stood frozen, his eyes widening as the reality of what she was saying sank in. Then, he blinked, his expression quickly morphing into one of confusion, and then, to Jane's horror, one of annoyance. Come on, Jane. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice dismissive. This isn't what you think. It was a mistake. A stupid mistake. That's all. A mistake? Jane's voice rose, trembling with disbelief. A mistake. You've been having an affair with my mother for God knows how long, and you call that a mistake? Her hands shook as she held up the crumpled letter, waving it in front of his face. This is the proof, Tom. Don't stand there and pretend like this is some minor slip-up. Tom shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting away from the letter. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck, his nervous energy only making Jane more furious. I'm sorry, Jane, he muttered, his voice low and defeated. It wasn't supposed to happen. It just did. He seemed to be grasping for the right words, but nothing he said could ever justify the betrayal. Jane could feel the tears beginning to well up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't cry in front of him, not after everything he had done. You're sorry? She spat. That's it? After everything? After years of marriage? You do this to me? And with my mother? The words hung in the air like poison, each one sharper than the last. At that moment, the front door creaked open, and Evelyn stepped into the room. Her eyes immediately landed on Jane, and for the briefest of moments, a flicker of guilt passed over her face. But it was gone almost instantly, replaced with a sense of calm that only added to Jane's fury. Evelyn was standing there, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just shattered her daughter's entire world. Mom, Jane choked out, her voice breaking. Is this true? Did you really have an affair with Tom? Evelyn didn't answer right away. She hesitated, looking between Tom and Jane, before finally meeting Jane's gaze. Yes, Jane, she said softly, her voice unsteady. It's true. I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to find out like this, but it happened, and I couldn't stop it. The admission hit Jane harder than any blow. Her mother, the person who had always been there for her, the one she had trusted more than anyone, had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Jane's heart felt like it was being ripped out of her chest. The weight of the betrayal crushed her, leaving her unable to speak for a long, painful moment. I can't believe this, Jane whispered, her voice barely audible. I can't believe you both. I gave you everything, my trust, my love, and this is what you do with it. Her words were laced with raw emotion, a mixture of hurt, anger, and confusion. How could you do this to me? After everything we've been through. Evelyn stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached out toward Jane. I never wanted to hurt you, Jane, but I love him. I'm sorry. I never meant for you to find out this way. Jane recoiled from her touch, unable to contain the wave of anger that surged through her. You love him? She repeated bitterly. What about me, Mom? What about the years we've spent together as a family? She shook her head in disbelief, her voice breaking. You've destroyed everything. Tom stood silent in the background, seemingly powerless. His eyes were downcast, guilt written all over his face, but Jane could see the emptiness in his expression. He didn't seem to care. It was as if the truth had lost all meaning to him. The silence in the room was deafening, each of them lost in their own emotional turmoil. Jane's chest tightened, and she felt as though she couldn't breathe. The weight of her heartbreak, of everything she had just learned, was suffocating her. She looked from Tom to Evelyn, the two people she had loved and trusted more than anyone, and she could feel the last remnants of her world slipping away. Everything she had known to be true was now shattered. The life they had built together, the love they had promised her, was nothing but a lie. "I don't know what to say to either of you," Jane whispered, her voice hollow. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you." And with those words, she turned and walked out of the room, her heart broken beyond repair, her world unrecognizably shattered. The hours stretched into an agonizing blur as Jane sat in the dimly lit room, the silence broken only by the sound of her own breathing. The once warm, familiar space now felt foreign to her, heavy, suffocating, like the walls were closing in. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the same letter she had found just days earlier, the crumpled paper now a symbol of the devastation that had upended her life. Her fingers trembled as she traced the ink on the page, as if the words themselves held the power to rip apart whatever was left of her. The grief she had felt when she first discovered the affair had burned through her like wildfire, hot, sharp, and blinding. But as the days passed, that raw pain began to morph into something else, something darker. What had once been a gut-wrenching ache now settled into a cold, simmering fury. She could no longer look at Tom without seeing the face of the man who had shattered her trust. She couldn't look at her mother without seeing the betrayal in her eyes. They had both taken something precious from her, something that could never be replaced. And now she would make them pay for it. At first, Jane had tried to convince herself that time would heal her wounds. She tried to find solace in the notion that one day the anger would fade and she would move on. But as the days wore on, the pain only intensified. It became a constant, gnawing presence inside her, a deep, insidious ache that demanded resolution. Revenge wasn't something she had ever considered, at least not in the depths of her heart. But now, with her life shattered and nothing left to lose, revenge became her only outlet. Sleep eluded her. Her mind, once a place of warmth and love, had become a war zone. She would lie awake at night, her thoughts racing with images of Tom and Evelyn, their faces twisted with guilt and remorse. But that wasn't enough for her. They needed to understand what they had done to her, truly understand the depth of her pain. And in her mind, the only way to make them feel that was to take everything they held dear, just as they had done to her. Jane's thoughts began to grow darker with each passing hour. At first, she tried to block out the idea, but with every minute she spent contemplating it, the thought became more powerful, more consuming. The plans began to take shape, each one more calculated than the last. She would not act impulsively. She would not let emotion cloud her judgment. This was something that needed to be done carefully, with precision. She began to research. Late into the night, she scoured the internet for methods, for ways to carry out her plan without leaving a trace. Poison seemed the most fitting, a slow, insidious method that would give her time to watch them suffer, just as she had suffered. It was a cold, calculating choice, one that required meticulous preparation. She needed to get the right dosage, the right timing. Everything had to be perfect. The next days were a blur of secretive shopping trips and hours spent in the kitchen, pretending to be the woman she once was, loving, caring, the devoted wife and daughter. But inside, she was a stranger to herself. Each smile she forced, each conversation she held with Tom or Evelyn was just a mask, a performance she put on to hide the monster she had become. They didn't know it yet, but the very food she prepared for them would become their final meal. The thought sent a chill through her veins, but it also gave her a twisted sense of satisfaction. This would be her retribution. This would be her justice. As she gathered the necessary ingredients, Jane began to feel a sense of control return to her. For the first time in days, she felt clear-headed, focused. The grief had been replaced by a quiet, lethal determination. She imagined Tom and Evelyn sitting across from her at the dinner table, unaware of the darkness that was about to descend upon them. They would eat, laugh, and drink, just as they had always done. And when it was over, when the poison had worked its way through their bodies, when their final breaths had been drawn, she would be the one left standing, alone, but finally in control. There was no turning back now. Jane knew that. She had crossed a line, and there was no way to uncross it. But in her mind, the world had already crossed a line first, when Tom and Evelyn betrayed her. What they had taken from her could never be returned. The loss was too great, the hurt too deep. She needed to make them feel it too. She needed to ensure that the consequences of their actions would haunt them forever. The following night, Jane prepared a simple meal. She made sure to take extra care with each dish, paying attention to the small details. She would offer them one last semblance of hospitality before she ended their lives. The smell of the food filled the house, but it only served to make her stomach churn. She didn't eat. She couldn't. Her appetite had long since disappeared, replaced by the hunger for revenge. As she set the table, she couldn't help but wonder how it would feel, watching them eat, hearing their laughter, knowing that with each bite, they were unknowingly sealing their own fate. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, but it also made her feel powerful, in control. This was her moment, the moment when she would finally reclaim the power that had been stolen from her. This was her moment of reckoning, and with that thought, Jane stood up from the table, her face cold and determined. She was no longer the woman she once was. She was something else now, a woman transformed, consumed by a need for vengeance. The woman who had loved and trusted would soon be gone, and in her place would stand the executioner. The evening was supposed to be ordinary, just another dinner gathering, a chance for Jane to spend time with Tom and Evelyn, the two people she once trusted above all else. But beneath the surface, everything was anything but normal. The atmosphere, though outwardly calm, was thick with tension. Each movement felt deliberate, calculated. Every word spoken was laced with a hidden purpose. Jane, now a woman transformed, held a secret they could never have imagined. She had invited them here tonight, not to celebrate, but to end everything, to make them pay. As Jane set the table, she noticed how little they suspected. Tom sat at the far end, engrossed in his phone, checking messages with the casual disinterest of a man who believed everything was fine. Evelyn, her mother, sat at the opposite end, fiddling with her wineglass, her eyes flitting nervously between Jane and Tom, unsure of what was happening, but too polite to question it. There was a sense of normalcy that made Jane's heart race with dread. This would be The last time they sat here together, the last time they would smile at her as though nothing had changed. The soft clinking of plates and silverware echoed in the quiet dining room, and Jane forced herself to smile, her face a mask of calm. She had spent the past few days carefully planning this moment, ensuring that every detail was perfect. She had chosen the meal herself, knowing that food would be the vehicle of their final moments. It was a meal they would never finish, a dinner that would serve as their last. As she placed the final dish on the table, a familiar warmth spread through her chest. It was a warmth she hadn't felt in days, maybe even weeks. It was the warmth of control, of power. She had taken everything into her own hands, and now she would carry out the plan she had devised with such precision. There would be no chaos, no outbursts, just silence. And then the inevitable. Jane watched as Evelyn took her seat, and Tom looked up from his phone, nodding toward Jane. He smiled, oblivious to the storm swirling inside her. His casual demeanor grated on her nerves, as did the way he so easily ignored her pain. He didn't know it yet, but in just a few hours, he would be lying lifeless on the same table that had once been filled with laughter and love. "Smells amazing," Tom said, leaning in to take a whiff of the dish. "What's the secret ingredient?" "Nothing too fancy," Jane replied with a tight smile, her voice steady, though inside her pulse quickened. "Just a little something I learned recently. A recipe from an old friend." Evelyn looked up at Jane, her face filled with curiosity. "You always know how to make the simplest things so special, dear." Jane forced another smile, the words stinging as they left her lips. She nodded, pretending to be touched by her mother's praise. It was so easy for Evelyn to overlook the cracks in their relationship, to pretend that nothing had changed. Jane had once shared everything with her mother, but now that trust had been shattered into irreparable pieces. As they began to eat, Jane watched them closely. The silence that followed was almost deafening, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass of wine, her eyes scanning the room, but neither Tom nor Evelyn suspected anything was wrong. The moment had come. She took a sip from her glass, watching as Tom and Evelyn ate, slowly but steadily. She had spent hours preparing the meal, ensuring every detail was perfect. The poison she had carefully chosen was odorless, tasteless, and lethal in small doses. She had calculated the exact amount needed to ensure that neither of them would survive the night, but that it wouldn't be too quick. She wanted them to feel the weight of their actions. She wanted them to understand what they had done to her. As Jane ate, she could feel the tension mounting inside her. The poison was taking effect, but she had to remain calm. She had to act as though nothing was wrong, as though she were still the loving wife and daughter they knew her to be. But every second felt like an eternity. She could feel her pulse racing, her breath shallow, as if she were holding her own life in her hands. Evelyn was the first to react. She placed her fork down slowly, her face turning pale. I don't feel well," she said, her voice soft and shaky. "I think I need to lie down." Tom glanced up at his mother-in-law, a frown forming on his face. "What's wrong with you? Maybe you ate too fast." But Evelyn's eyes were already beginning to glaze over, her breath growing shallow. "No, Tom, She couldn't finish the sentence. She clutched her chest, her body trembling with the first signs of the poison's effect. Jane watched silently, her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She didn't move. This was what she had planned. This was what she had expected. Evelyn's body was already beginning to slump, her hand falling onto the table with a soft thud. Tom noticed the change in her demeanor, his face scrunching in confusion, but it wasn't long before he, too, began to feel the effects. His voice became unsteady. "Jane, I don't feel right. Something's wrong with my stomach." The room seemed to spin. Tom's face twisted with discomfort, his hand clutching his stomach as he doubled over in pain. Evelyn was already unconscious, her head resting against the table. The realization that the plan was working filled Jane with an eerie sense of calm. They had no idea what was happening to them. They were slipping away, slowly, quietly, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Tom's eyes widened in horror as his body began to betray him. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the floor with a sickening thud. Jane watched as he writhed in agony, his hands clutching at his chest, gasping for air. Evelyn lay motionless, her body still, her face pale and contorted in a final expression of pain. The room was silent, save for the faint sound of their labored breathing. Jane remained seated, her gaze fixed on them as they struggled. There was no drama, no screaming, only the quiet, creeping certainty of death inching its way toward them, just as she had planned. They had betrayed her, and now they would pay the price. Minutes passed, and finally, their struggles ceased. Evelyn and Tom lay still, their bodies unmoving, the room now filled with an unnatural silence. The last remnants of Jane's grief and anger began to fade, replaced by something else, a strange sense of finality. Jane stood up slowly, looking down at their lifeless forms. There was no satisfaction in the moment, no relief, only the cold certainty that she had done what needed to be done. The world she had once known was gone forever, and she was left standing alone in the aftermath of her own making. The sun had barely risen when the police arrived at Jane's house, responding to a call made by a concerned neighbor who hadn't seen Tom or Evelyn for a couple of days. The sudden disappearance of both of them was unusual enough to warrant attention, and the growing suspicion surrounding their absence was palpable. Jane, however, greeted the officers with feigned shock, her face twisted in a mask of grief and confusion. She stood at the doorstep, her hands clasped together tightly, her voice trembling as she recounted the last time she'd seen her husband and mother. I don't know where they could be," she stammered, her eyes wide with what seemed like genuine concern. "I thought they were just out, maybe running errands. They've never been gone this long before." The officers, despite her convincing demeanor, exchanged a brief glance, taking note of her over-the-top reactions and the coldness that lingered beneath her tears. Jane's perfectly choreographed performance wasn't fooling anyone. She played the grieving wife and daughter with such precision, though to anyone paying close attention, there was an unsettling calm about her. Her voice quivered, but her eyes remained steely, betraying the true emotions swirling beneath the surface. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, the calmness stark in contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. The police began their search, starting with the living room, where the family had last been seen. It was clear that nothing appeared out of place. The untouched dinner plates, the half-drunk glasses of wine on the table, everything seemed perfectly ordinary, but something felt wrong. The officers had seen enough cases to understand that appearances could be deceiving. They moved cautiously, combing through the house, and it wasn't long before one of the detectives found a clue that would unravel Jane's carefully constructed web of lies. A note, crumpled in the corner of the kitchen garbage bin, caught his attention. It wasn't an ordinary piece of paper. It was a letter, an intimate, love-stricken note from Tom to Evelyn, written in passionate, unmistakable handwriting. The detective's eyes narrowed as he examined the paper, the realization setting in. The affair wasn't just an uncomfortable suspicion, it was a fact. And Jane had known. Still, the officers continued their investigation, trying to piece together the events leading up to Tom and Evelyn's disappearance. Jane continued to feign ignorance, even playing the role of a devastated wife in front of the detectives. "I just don't understand," she said, her voice shaken, as if the weight of grief was too much to bear. "I loved them both so much. How could this happen? Why didn't they tell me? Why didn't they come home?" Her words dripped with sorrow, but the detective's eyes never left her face, watching for any flicker of guilt or hesitation. There was something strange about her, something almost too perfect in her display of emotion. As Jane wiped away a tear, she seemed more focused on the role she was playing than on the loss she claimed to feel. The scene shifted to the discovery of the bodies. A forensic team was called in, and after hours of searching the property, they found Tom and Evelyn's bodies, hidden in the garden behind the house. They were positioned carefully, as though Jane had arranged them with a macabre sense of finality. Their faces were pale, their limbs cold, the aftermath of the poisoning Jane had carefully orchestrated. The police remained quiet, exchanging solemn glances as they investigated the bodies. Jane, still standing by the door, could feel a mix of emotions swirling within her. The guilt, the anger, the revenge, it all seemed so distant now. They were gone, and nothing could bring them back. She felt no remorse, no regret, just an eerie emptiness. As the officers came back inside, they questioned Jane again, trying to press her for details, but her story remained unchanged. She spoke of how she hadn't seen or heard from Tom and Evelyn for days, how worried she was that something terrible had happened to them. Her eyes were wide with distress, but the subtle tension in her jaw betrayed her calm composure. "I never imagined something like this could happen," Jane murmured, glancing at the detectives. "I thought they were just out of town, spending time together. It was normal for them to go off on their own sometimes. But this isn't normal." The more she spoke, the more the detectives began to feel that she was hiding something. Her coldness was becoming harder to ignore, the subtle confidence beneath her distressing performance growing more apparent. Yet, despite the growing suspicion, there was no hard evidence to connect her to the murders. She had covered her tracks meticulously. Her involvement, though apparent to some, remained elusive. As the police prepared to leave for the night, Jane stayed behind, standing at the doorway, watching them walk away. She held herself together, but inside, her emotions swirled. She had done it. She had gotten away with it. For now. As she stepped back into the house, the quiet, suffocating silence enveloped her. But in the back of her mind, there was a feeling she couldn't shake, a sense of satisfaction. No one could truly understand the depth of her pain, the torment she had endured from both Tom and Evelyn. She had lost her family, but she had reclaimed her life. The anger that had once consumed her had given way to a cold, calculating calm. Jane had her vengeance, and nothing, it seemed, could undo that. As the investigation into the deaths of Tom and Evelyn progressed, The detectives began piecing together the small but crucial details that might explain the tragic events. Jane, initially devastated by the loss of her husband and mother, was now under close scrutiny. While there was no clear evidence linking her to the crime, something about her demeanor made the detectives uneasy. The first few days were spent interviewing friends, family, and neighbors, all of whom spoke highly of Jane, her close relationship with her mother, her devotion to Tom, the seemingly perfect marriage they had. On the surface, everything seemed to corroborate Jane's story, but as the detectives dug deeper, they started to uncover inconsistencies. Jane's version of events, while calm and collected, had small gaps. When asked about the last time she saw Tom and Evelyn, her answers didn't quite add up. She mentioned several times how she hadn't seen them for days, but when pressed further, her timeline seemed off. Her recollection of their last conversation didn't match the reports from neighbors who had seen Tom and Evelyn just hours before their deaths. Jane claimed they had disappeared without a trace, but there was no record of them leaving the house. No one had seen them leave. As the detectives conducted a thorough search of the house, they found traces of poison, small, almost imperceptible remnants of a chemical compound on the dinnerware Jane had used that night. But there was no clear proof that she had been the one to administer it. No fingerprints, no direct evidence. Jane had been too careful, too calculated. Still, there was something about her that the detectives couldn't ignore. Her grief, while convincing on the surface, lacked the rawness one would expect from a woman who had just lost everything. Jane never broke down. She remained composed, even cold at times. There was a chilling detachment in her eyes when she spoke about her mother and husband. One evening, Detective Harris sat down with Jane for another round of questioning. The room was tense, the air thick with suspicion. He asked her about the dinner she had prepared for her husband and mother, trying to gauge her reaction. Jane's response was almost too rehearsed, too perfect. She spoke of how they had all enjoyed a quiet meal together before they vanished, her voice steady, almost robotic. But when Harris pressed her on the details of the evening, something flickered in Jane's eyes. A brief moment of hesitation, a slight pause, a slip-up. She said something about a conversation she had with her mother that seemed strangely out of place, given the timeline of events. The detective noted the subtle inconsistency. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fuel his growing suspicion. Her perfect story was beginning to unravel, revealing the cracks in her alibi. He had seen it before. Small mistakes, tiny lapses in memory that spoke volumes about guilt. But even as the investigators closed in, Jane's calm exterior never faltered. She was playing her part too well. The more they pressed, the more she seemed to slip further into her role, becoming the grieving wife and daughter who had lost everything. Yet, underneath the facade, the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that Jane was hiding something far darker than mere grief. The investigation had been dragging on for weeks, but Detective Harris could feel the breakthrough was near. Jane had been playing her part to perfection. The grieving widow, the heartbroken daughter, all too willing to cooperate. But the detectives had pieced together enough evidence to make a compelling case. The traces of poison, the inconsistencies in her story, and the coldness in her demeanor were beginning to paint a clear picture. It wasn't long before the detectives gathered the final piece of the puzzle. They brought Jane in for a final interrogation, one last attempt to get her to break. They confronted her with the overwhelming evidence: her mother's handwriting on a love letter found in Tom's office, traces of the poison on the dinnerware, and the fact that the only person who had the opportunity to poison both Tom and Evelyn was Jane herself. For the first time, Jane's composure began to slip. Her usually calm demeanor wavered as the detectives laid the evidence before her. The room was tense, the air thick with the weight of the truth that was about to come to light. The detectives gave her a moment, and then Harris asked the question that had been hanging in the air for so long. "Jane, why did you do it? Why kill the two people who you loved most in this world?" The silence that followed was deafening. For a long moment, Jane said nothing. Her eyes, which had once been calm and composed, now flashed with something darker, something cold. The truth, long buried beneath layers of grief and denial, was slowly making its way to the surface. Finally, she spoke. "They deserved it, both of them." Her voice was steady, almost emotionless. It was a stark contrast to the weeping widow the detectives had seen just days before. "I loved them both," she continued, her voice tinged with bitterness. "But I was betrayed in the worst possible way. They tore apart everything I had, everything I believed in. They destroyed me, and I had to destroy them in return." The confession came with a finality that sent a chill down the spines of the investigators. Jane wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. She was a cold-hearted killer, driven by betrayal and rage. The woman who had once appeared so loving, so innocent, was now exposed for the monster she had become. As the weight of her words hung in the air, Detective Harris couldn't help but feel a mix of disbelief and revulsion. The woman he had once believed was a victim of an unimaginable crime had, in fact, orchestrated her own tragedy, one that had destroyed not just the lives of her victims, but her own as well. Jane sat there, her gaze unwavering, as if she had been waiting for this moment of reckoning. There was no regret, no sorrow in her eyes, just a cold, calculated finality. She had taken the lives of the two people who had once meant everything to her, and in doing so, she had irrevocably changed her own life forever. The courtroom was silent as the final verdict was read. Jane had been sentenced to life in prison, but no punishment could ever truly capture the depth of her crime. In the years that followed, she would be remembered not as a victim, but as a woman who allowed the sharp sting of betrayal to twist her heart into something unrecognizable. As the camera pulls back, we see Jane sitting alone in her prison cell, staring out at the world she once knew. The photograph of her former life, her smiling husband, her loving mother, rests on the table in front of her, now just a painful reminder of the life she lost. The world outside had moved on, but Jane had been trapped in a prison of her own making. Voiceover. Betrayal. The kind that cuts deepest, that shatters everything you believe in, can change a person in ways no one could ever imagine. Jane's love for her family once defined her life. But when that love turned to hatred, when trust was broken beyond repair, the lines between love and hate became blurred beyond recognition. The screen fades to black as the haunting echo of her confession lingers. A final shot of Jane, now a shadow of the woman she once was, serves as a chilling reminder. No one is immune to the darkness that betrayal can unleash. Voiceover. In the end, the story of Jane is a tragic one, a story of love, trust, and the devastating power of betrayal. It serves as a cautionary tale. Sometimes the heart can be so broken, it loses its way entirely. And when that happens, the consequences can be irreversible. The screen fades out, leaving viewers to ponder the true cost of betrayal and how far the human heart can be pushed before it breaks